Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Charmaine Nelson, and I'm employed as a professor, a provost professor of art history in the History of Art and Architecture department at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, where I'm also the I'm also the director of Slavery North Initiative. Now, Slavery North is actually the new incarnation of the Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery, which I founded in 2020 at NSCAD University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. I would like to thank my colleagues and students at NSCAD, as well as community members and media outlets in Halifax, Toronto, and Montreal who have supported me and the Institute over the last 2 years. I would specifically like to thank the producer, Alex Mason, and the journalist, Jeff Douglas, who hosted me many, many times on CBC Radio Main Street in Halifax. A special thanks also to Will Robinson and Annie Godet for their technical assistance across many of our events over the last 2 years. So with my relocation to UMass, the state's flagship campus, I have brought the Institute with me and expanded the mandate to include the support of research and research creation, meaning artistic and cultural production, on Canadian slavery and slavery in the American North. As before, we continue to host fellows and to convene exhibitions, events, conferences, and talks, and to produce media work that engages both academic and lay audiences on these very important and often erased histories. Please check the chat for a link to our YouTube channel, where you can view some of our important outcomes from the last 2 years. And please also stay tuned for the launch of our new website, hopefully this fall. UMass Amherst sits on Indigenous lands, which have been stewarded by several Indigenous nations for millennia. A critical engagement of transatlantic slavery necessitates the centering of Black and Indigenous histories and experiences. And one of Slavery North's mandate areas is the study of Black and Indigenous relations. So we gather for a second Fellows Talk at Slavery North. Our fellow today, Amanda Trager, will be speaking for about 30 to 40 minutes. And we will leave about 15 minutes at the end for your questions and comments, which I will moderate. So please feel free to type your questions in the chat or Q&A for Amanda. Please also note that this event is being recorded, and you'll be able to find it then later on our YouTube channel. So Amanda Trager is an American intermediate artist who lives in both Canada and the USA. Her research-based work situates narratives within distinct aesthetic realms, primarily known for her collaborative partnership with her husband, Eric Moskowitz, which began in 2006. She has exhibited and screened work internationally at venues that include Centre Pompidou, Jeu de Paume in Paris, IFFR in Rotterdam, Reina Sofia in Madrid, Haus de Kulturen de Welt in Berlin, the Mexicali Biennale in California and Mexico, and 303 Gallery and Participant Inc. in New York City. This work has been supported by artist residencies at the Montalvo Art Center and Headland Center for the Arts, both in California. And they have been recipients of grants, including numerous ones from the New York State Council for the Arts, and awards that include the Short Film Grand Prize in the Indie Lisboa in Portugal. So I'll hand it over to Amanda now, and I'll be back at the end to moderate her questions. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you for that, Charmaine. Can everyone hear me? I'm going to assume so. And I did want to begin by thanking Dr. Nelson just for being who you are, Charmaine, and for devoting yourself to the work that you do, and for all that you've taught me so far. And also, certainly, for the support of the Artist in Residence Fellowship, which is making my project possible. And the talk I'm about to give is going to be divided into 6 parts. And I'll be sort of saying that at the front. And in the first part, you'll see images from my work with Eric Moskowitz. And in the second part, I'll show images that I began to collect and think through with my friend Andrew McNeely in response to a talk between Fred Moten and Sadia Hartman at Duke University in 2016 that was called The Black Outdoors. So those images will cycle through at least once, and they may correlate with my talk at certain times. They also may not correlate. If you find this distracting, feel free to just close your eyes and listen, or the other way around. Okay, so to begin with part one, new things. This talk is exciting for me because I've never done anything quite like it. And I'm now gonna just share the screen. For this slideshow, this first slideshow. Because I have a career as a visual artist, as manifested variously over many years, but since 2008 in video, installation, and experimental film. I've given many artist talks in the past, but artist talks tend to look backwards, or at least are grounded in presenting work that the artist has made before. But this presentation addresses a project that will use a form of address new to me, in that the work in experimental film will contain what I think of as an extended public service announcement in the manner of a documentary film. And while I'm not abandoning my usual stomping grounds, art and experimental film worlds where abstract approaches are the norm, the film I'm making must be explicitly message-driven and be considered as a form of research, or to use the Canadian term, research creation. I say must because I'm creating something that's deeply beholden to a process of working with others, as the film constitutes my thesis project at NSCAD University, where I'm earning my master's degree in art education in the community-based practice track, with Dr. Nelson as my thesis advisor and Dr. Jocelyn Gardner as committee member, in conjunction with my fellowship at the Institute, or the Slavery North Initiative, as it's now called. There is therefore a thicket of people and viewpoints that support me, but which I in turn must accommodate, an opportunity I sought and for which I'm grateful. But again, this is new. My approach in past work, like many, if not most artists, has tended to center the I, me, and my, as in my vision, my passion, etc. And the artist has traditionally been framed and lionized in the public's imagination in this manner. The stress on individuality has, in my case, at least been somewhat softened through 15 years of collaboration with my husband, Eric Moskowitz, whereby we've tried to inhabit, through our work with one another and others, what could be called a multiplicitous self. And I'm going to just stop that slideshow now. But with my thesis project, I'll briefly be stepping away from this artistic partnership with Eric, which is another scary but exciting news for me. Finally, my subject revolves around history, Canadian history. And I'm not by any means a trained historian, nor am I Canadian. And though I do spend a lot of time in Canada, it's in the Maritimes, not Quebec, where the work is rooted. So to begin part two, and I'll start the second slide show now. All right, so I'm introducing the project, and you're seeing these kind of somewhat non-correlating images. The general message explicated by the film that I'm going to be making arises from the fact that Canada has persistently but misleadingly presented itself as the safe haven found at the end of the Underground Railroad. But this feel-good slice of history, enshrined in national curricula and popular imagination, lasted a mere 30 years. As such, the narrative is a cherry-picked snippet of a longer and ignominious history. My aim is to shed light on some aspects of the 200-year practice of slavery in pre-Confederation Canada. And I'll do this by zooming in on details and zooming out for context. This is because the history of Canadian slavery is a vast topic as well as a vastly underknown and understudied one, but needs to be understood within the scope of transatlantic slave economies. One way of rendering so-called New World slavery marginally comprehensible is through focus on the lived experiences of those individuals forced to live as slaves. And this is standard practice in the US with its many documentaries and narrative films on individual resistors. Who among us, including the Canadians here, don't know the names Harriet Tubman, Harriet Jacobs, Solomon Northup, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass? And yet I wonder if anyone, apart from the insiders here, knows the name Marie-Josèph Angélique, whose story, while radically different from the well-known self-emancipators and abolitionists I just mentioned, holds enormous power and piquancy. And I will be making an approximately hour-long experimental documentary film about Angélique's life and times through an account of events that took place in Montreal in 1734. Marie-Josèph Angélique was born in Madeira, Portugal around 1705, and she's known to us as an enslaved Black woman who was owned by Francois Poulin de Francheville, and following his death to his widow, Thérèse, Madame Francheville. Angélique is probably the most well-known, unknown figure of resistance to Canadian slavery. And this is despite the fact that there have been two biographies written about her. One by Afua Cooper in 2006, entitled The Hanging of Angélique, The Untold Story of Canadian Slavery and the Burning of Old Montreal. And the other, The Trial of Marie-Josèph Angélique, written by Denise Beaugrand Champagne in 2004. Additionally, Angélique was the subject of an acclaimed 1990 play by Lorena Gale that is still performed nearly every year in Montreal. In 2006, her story became a module for an innovative online teaching tool called Great Unsolved Mysteries in Canadian History. Angélique has been the subject of museum exhibitions and artworks in various media. And in 2012, the public square across from Montreal's City Hall was named after her. So while my film aims to help spread the word that Canada is a country that supported and practiced slavery for 2 centuries and under 2 empires, the French and the English, sharing details of Angélique's life elucidates nuance, including her relationship to a white indentured servant named Claude Thibault. Some basic facts about their history. The reason we know as much as we do about this pair is related to a large fire in Montreal in 1734. Montreal at the time was a French colony, the departure point for trade and military expeditions to the country's, or present day in Canada's, interior. Though predominantly French populated, it was more diversified than we might have thought, inhabited by allied Amerindians, numerous slaves from enemy nations, along with a large garrison of French-speaking soldiers, as well as French-speaking businessmen and their families. With 2,000 inhabitants, Montreal was a respectably sized town by the standards of the time. So the 1734 fire was significant. While no one died, 46 houses, shops, and stores were destroyed. People lost expensive clothing, important business documents, legal documents, money itself burned, and the poor lost everything. And hundreds of people were rendered homeless. A hospital, or the hospital, which had just been rebuilt following a larger fire in 1721, also burned, as did its adjacent chapel and convent. Fire was, of course, so who was to blame? So fire was, of course, an essential part of life at the time, a source of heating and light, for example. But people were shaken and they were angry. So the notion of a scapegoat may be of relevance here. Marie-Josèph Angélique and Claude Thibault were accused of starting the fire, which led to a 6-week trial. And the accusation against them didn't exist in a vacuum. And I'll quickly explain why using the present tense. A few months before the 1734 fire, in the depths of a snowy Montreal winter, Angélique, an enslaved Black woman, and Thibault, a white indentured servant, who were lovers at the time, plan a getaway. They make it as far as Chambly, Quebec, 60 miles away, but they're recaptured and brought back to Montreal, where they face mild consequences by the standards of the time. At that point, according to Cooper, they begin to plan their next escape, then the fire in April. At that point, Angélique is arrested almost immediately, and it's presumed that the couple started the fire as a way to enable a successful flight, a distraction for would-be pursuers. Also, as vengeance against the woman who held power over them, Madame Francheville, Angélique's owner and Thibault's boss. But why isn't Thibault arrested? Well, because he's nowhere in sight. He's gotten away. Angélique, now imprisoned, maintains her own and the absent Thibault's innocence, but is convicted upon the conclusion of the 6-week trial. Throughout this entire time, from the time of her arrest and up to and through the time of her protracted public execution, Angélique refuses to name Thibault as a co-conspirator, despite enduring physical torture throughout the process. Part 3, zooming in and out again. The details of this history turn accepted wisdom on the topic of slavery in the so-called New World on its head in many ways. These and other details I'll share in a moment offer ways of glimpsing, holding in one's mind, if only for a split second, the totalizing and horrific scope of racial slavery. The word totalizing can be understood in different ways, but for me, it's helpful to consider it in the context of the work of the well-known and recently deceased thinker, Emanuel Wallerstein, who developed what is called world systems analysis, which emerged in the 1970s. And this analysis is a multidisciplinary approach to history and social change, which emphasizes an interconnected world, not individual nation states, as the primary unit of social analysis. It's a big picture form of analysis predicated on Marxist analysis and other schools of thought, notably Jacques Brodell's Annales school, and an approach to understanding history through the lens of very long timeframes. More specifically, it refers to divisions of labor operating between regions and across nations, dividing the world into categories whereby core countries focus on higher skill, capital-intensive production, and the rest of the world focuses on low skill, labor-intensive production and extraction of raw materials. World systems analysis also maintains that while these relationships may change, or that the category or status of an individual nation state may change, the essential dynamic revolving on extraction-based power imbalances and their reproduction remains fixed. I hope everything is still okay. The transatlantic slave, in terms of this presentation, the transatlantic slave trade and its aftermath must be understood within this longue durée, which is a phrase from Jacques Brodel, and Angélique's story must be understood within this long time frame, as well as the physical dimensions of a hemisphere, as encompassed by world systems analysis. The approach runs counter to more typical understandings, whereby modern era slavery has, until very recently, been spatially and temporally limited, usually to the 19th century US South. The actual extended map of slavery is understudied and further denied through simplifications implicit in a term like the triangle trade. But Angélique's story traces and reflects the global extent of the transatlantic slave trade, because what befell her was nothing less than the convergence of histories of slavery spanning 3 continents and 4 empires. And just a little background to explain what I mean here is that the early modern period of slavery can be said to have begun in 1441, when Portuguese traders brought the first large number of enslaved Africans to Europe, including to Portugal, their own country. And the Portuguese were the one who in 1526 brought the first shipload of enslaved African slaves to Brazil, thus introducing a transatlantic dimension to the slave trade. So in a continuum of this earlier history, Angélique's forced, quote, Atlantic Odyssey, to use Cooper's phrase, begins not in Africa, but in Portugal. Angélique's story, her personal, begins in Portugal. When she is forcibly moved to the Dutch Republic, another early and big, but now often overlooked player in this history. From there, Angélique is shunted across that grisly human highway, the Atlantic Ocean, to land in New England, or possibly New York, we're not sure, and finally taken north to New France in present-day Canada. And she's 20 years old at that point. Her path mirrors patterns of movement of many, if not most, enslaved people of African descent, particularly those arriving to temperate climate destinations. This is not to say that Angélique's particular route was universal, but that mappings of triangle trade routes are simplified generalizations that, in addition to neglecting Canada, also omit south-north slave trade routes, specifically between the Caribbean and Canada, which Dr. Nelson in 2016 conceptualized as, quote, the second Middle Passage. Additionally, Angélique's life story provides details particular to the experience of slavery in slave minority temperate climate centers, including urban ones. And these are the regions of study in Dr. Nelson's current Slavery North initiative. Angélique's experiences unfolding in the confines of her owner's Montreal home, as distinct from, say, that of an enslaved field worker on a Southern or Caribbean plantation, were marked by hyper-surveillance, also a near total isolation from anyone with whom she may have shared even a small piece of her past life, or people in her community prior to arrival to Montreal, including family members and people with whom she may have formed bonds somewhere, anywhere along her path of forced migration. It also meant living in a world where interactions with fellow Portuguese-speaking people, including those of African descent, or many Black people at all, were few and far between. This isolation was accentuated by long, brutally cold winters to which Angélique was unaccustomed. Additionally, Angélique's particular experience as an enslaved female in these circumstances included the constant possibility of and reality of rape and the use of her body for purposes of breeding. Physical atrocities of this kind, which also included corporal punishment in Angélique's case and those of countless others, are not often associated with Canada or other slave minority temperate climate locations. But they were in fact common, as they were and are everywhere slavery exists. This brings me back to the word totalizing, which I've tried to explain using world systems analysis in relationship to the circumstances of Angélique's life in the early 18th century, which one must do, for example, by envisioning Angélique crossing or middle passage in relationship to the 12.5 million other enslaved Black people forced to make this journey, packed like sardines in fetid, airless shipholds. And in relationship to the millions who didn't make it, including pregnant women considered disruptive who were thrown overboard. And in relationship to the unknown numbers of women subjected to salacious and sadistic acts of violence on these ships, as well as off of them. And to literally countless other atrocities associated with this 400-year plus history of racial slavery. I want to also use the word enormity here as a word often and inaccurately confused with the notion of enormousness. The actual definition is, quote, the great or extreme scale, seriousness or extent of something perceived as bad or morally wrong, or a grave crime or sin. I found it useful to remember this word is a contraction of enormous and monstrosity, enormous monstrosity. Finding ways of rendering the enormity of slavery and its aftermath as comprehensible in our is our contemporary challenge, as well as our responsibility. It entails absorbing the unabsorbable facts of this still unfolding history, which also entails understanding the ways and means of media collusion. Part 4. We all know that modern history is heavily informed by documents or primary source material, things like 1, newspapers, 2, diaries and personal letters, and 3, official documents related to business or law, for example. So how do we know about Angélique and Thibault's history? By answering that question, which I'm about to do now, it's my intention to also correlate the past and present, specifically in relationship to media, because this correlation informs choices I've made for my film regarding both its form and content. So to begin with 1, newspapers. Okay, well, it's important to know that there were no newspapers in New France, ever. And this is because 1734 France was an absolutist regime, not a democratic one. It had even less tolerance for democracy in its North American colony, where freedom of expression was quite literally not allowed. The King Louis XV even prohibited the importation of printing presses. In the late 1700s and into the 1800s, when government controlled gazettes and then newspapers slowly began to become commonplace, they were still entirely controlled by an elite or enslaver class. So the stories of resistance were not broadcast. Nevertheless, and in a way, ironically, newspapers are our best source of information about the widespread resistance of enslaved people. And this is because when enslaved people managed to escape, their so-called masters would frequently publish ads. I mean, I shouldn't say so-called, but these people would frequently publish ads in the classified sections of newspapers offering a reward for the runaways' recapture and return. And we're in a period right now when scholars have realized the importance of these ads, known as runaway or fugitive slave ads. Scholars, however, are still in the process of amassing these ads in comprehensive, searchable data.
Okay, so Amanda seems to be frozen. We're going to see if we can get her back. Okay, Amanda, you were frozen there. So can you back up for about 30 seconds? Because we lost you for about 30 seconds. Thanks.
Okay, do you remember where I was?
You're talking about newspapers, and then you were moving on from the lack of the press. It was about 30 seconds. So about a couple.
King Louis XIV prohibited
Yes,
the importation.
excellent.
Okay, so late 1700s into the 1800s, when government controlled gazettes and then newspapers slowly began to become commonplace, they were still entirely controlled by an elite or enslaver class. So stories of resistance were not broadcast. Nevertheless, and in a way, quite ironically, newspapers are our best source of information about the widespread resistance of enslaved people. And this is because when enslaved people did manage to escape, their so-called, and in fact, actual masters would frequently publish ads in the classified section of papers, offering a reward for the runaways' recapture and return. We're in a period right now when scholars have realized the importance of these ads, known as runaway or fugitive slave ads. Nevertheless, scholars are still in the process of amassing these ads in comprehensive, searchable databases to allow for both big picture views with stats on, say, the time of year most people fled, the gender and age of those who attempted or succeeded in flight, how many, things also like how many teenage girls fled, how many pregnant girls and women fled, how many with babies or small children, and other questions like whether waves of escape correlated with economic trends or political events. This database or the individual slave ads also provide micro or detailed views of individual self-emancipators that illuminate their humanity with descriptions of the marks or scars on their bodies, the languages they spoke or understood, their individual talents and skills, the clothing they wore at the time of escape and or additional clothing they may have brought with them when fleeing, and outward effect, albeit in the eyes of the enslaver, but including how a person carried themselves or moved physically, habitual facial expressions, etc. These fugitive slave ads currently number in the tens of thousands. Not even considering their contents, their sheer volume decimates propagandistic claims that slavery accommodated an inherently docile people who were content in subservience. This propaganda was incredibly powerful, prevailing during slavery and well beyond it, even past the end of the Civil War, attested to by none other than W.E.B. Du Bois, as revealed in passages of his seminal work, The Souls of Black Folks, written in 1903, which is otherwise an incredibly important and beautiful moving work. But this false propaganda, this lie regarding innate subservience, overlay an even bigger one, which was that Black people were not human or not fully human, and should instead be thought of as as objects, commodities, things. And this was supported by complex and detailed legal mandates in many, many places of the so-called New World. It's important to note that the successful landing of this propaganda didn't happen overnight. This massive lie came into being very slowly over the span of centuries, as the Trinidadian politician and historian Eric Williams has so convincingly described in his books from the 1940s to the 1980s. This lie supported the escalation of the scope and institutionalization of slavery and its concomitant dehumanizing practices, all of which go hand in hand. In other words, the mind-numbing numbers of people who were enslaved and the utter brutality to which they were subjected could only be countenanced if those who benefited could convince themselves that Black people were unfeeling objects, tools, or machines, and that and the lie was successful because it supported not just individuals, but because it legitimated whole systems of colonization, of wealth accumulation for numbers of entire nations. Even as powerful entities like the Catholic Church knew it to be a lie and yet went along with it because they too were enriched. And sadly, we're currently seeing how this dynamic works in real time and how it is 100% abetted by the media, albeit in new ways. Because it's hard not to think about all of this in the context of today, including the big lie of US election deniers, to name just one example, and the logic that if the sick logic that if you repeat a falsehood often enough, for long enough, it will in some way become true. Let me say Orwellian logic. But to return to my question about media and how we know what we do about Angélique and Claude Thibault. If not through newspapers, because as I said earlier, there were none then and there, nor through personal letters or diaries, because extremely few have been found with bearing on that time and place, and none specifically mentioning Angélique or Thibault, that leaves official documents. And that is indeed how we know their history. Because we have a tribunal record, a detailed account of Angélique's trial. This document was adrift in the archives for two centuries, materially alive, but unseen and unknown until 1925. How, where, and by whom the archive came to light is something I intend to learn more about. This record, this archive, the 1734 court record, is amazing. It includes first-person testimony from Angélique and those in close proximity to her. And in so doing, the record offers extremely rare descriptions regarding the material culture of an enslaved Black female, her enslavers, and the community that supported the practice of slavery then and there. Even more striking and singular, the trial archive lays bare the emotional life of all involved, but most particularly Angélique, rendering her human to contemporary minds and hearts. Her testimony, terse as it is, as are all of the testimonies, but her testimony is considered one of the earliest eyewitness accounts of slavery from the perspective of an enslaved person and of a Black woman, describing, at least to some degree, both the conditions of her life as well as her state of mind. Most extraordinary, to me at least, are the accounts of Angélique's rage towards her female enslaver, Madame Francheville. The record states that Angélique, in moments of intense anger, addressed Francheville with expletives. She called her bitch to her face. She called her whore and made bold statements regarding her intentions to flee. She threatened to burn Madame Francheville's house down with Madame in it. She also expressed her hatred for white people and for French people, often to their faces. Wholly justified, though not strategic, on the part of Angélique, utterances such as these are not typically or indeed ever recorded in archives pertinent to the history of slavery, which of course does not mean they didn't happen all the time. But broadcasting these kinds of events would challenge false claims regarding Black thingliness, their non-humanity, which was not as stated in the interest of enslavers. They didn't want that getting out. Part 5, Angélique and Thibault as both relatable and unknowable. Angélique's particularity, her personhood, resonates loud and clear across nearly 3 centuries. Recognizable as a contemporary person in the body of a Black woman in the wrong time of history, or at the wrong time of in history, she transmits the sense that enslavement, all that it entailed, should not be happening to her. In other words, Angélique felt and behaved the same way we ourselves might were we to be thrown in her place. For some, Octavia Butler's 1979 science fiction novel, Kindred, comes to mind, whereby a protagonist, Dana, a 20th century African-American woman, travels back in time to an antebellum plantation in the US South. Through Dana, the reader experiences in their mind's eye slavery's depraved, brutish complexities. But the 1734 history is also significant because it tells the story of a collaboration between a Black woman and a white male. And the fact that Claude Thibault, a white male who was an indentured servant, fled with a woman, a Black woman, is highly unusual in the archives of runaway slave ads, which more typically document these attempts as occurring between men. Enslaved women fled less frequently compared to men for practical reasons I alluded to earlier when mentioning things like pregnancy and childcare, but also because the lives of men, whether free, indentured, or enslaved, brought them into the outside world. And thus to personal contacts, potentially helpful networks, and knowledge of the land with its routes, roads, and routes, including for some escape routes. So what drew Thibault to Angélique? Her abilities to navigate the terrain were not what his were. Why would he take on the risk of escaping with her? And Cooper maintains that their plan was to make it back to Europe together, but then at that point, go their separate ways. Thibault to France, where he's from, and Angélique back to Portugal. It's not exactly the living happily ever after narrative. Nevertheless, we have to wonder about their bond. And more questions accrue when considering Angélique's refusal to name him as a co-conspirator through her ordeal, when doing so would have lessened the severity of the torture she suffered, which was particularly pronounced by way of this medieval device of something called the boot, which crushed her lower limbs slowly. And Angélique did confess, but she still insisted that she had acted alone throughout all of this. Was her refusal to name Thibault an expression of her love for him? Thibault is also confounding just in and of himself. Unlike white abolitionists, who are most typically free people of means from the upper classes, Thibault's agency as an indentured servant was severely constricted, while not on par with Angélique's utter lack thereof. But Thibault quite literally had skin in the game in relation to his and Angélique's bid for freedom. Thibault was not, in fact, an abolitionist in any recognized or conventional sense, but a bonded man who felt at least some degree of emotional attachment to an enslaved Black woman with whom he lived, plotted, planned, and attempted flight. So was Thibault the ultimate accomplice in today's understanding of the word as it relates to racial justice? Perhaps, but in the end, Thibault fled alone, leaving Angélique to die a prolonged, horrific, and humiliating public death by execution. Needless to say, their story raises many questions, including the potential for and limitations to allyship across race, gender, and class. This is the last part 6, bringing it all together. With the goal of disseminating information about Angélique and Thibault in relationship to Canadian and transatlantic slavery, my research creation project seeks to determine the ways in which the emotional resonance of a message-driven documentary film can be amplified when combined with self-study and experimental film techniques. My hope is to learn more about myself and my subject positionality in the course of conducting this research. By inserting myself into an engagement with distant historical content, I also hope to encourage viewers' own self-questioning towards understanding of themselves as existing in a continuum with these histories. Between persuasion and facts lies story, which relates to history. And the Greek word historia means finding out and narrative, as well as history, which is an etymology that supports the idea that understanding our past requires narrative inquiry or storytelling. Considered a research method and a mode of representing the research study, the narrative approach can constitute the outcome of research. And this is true in the case of my research. Narrative inquiry will particularly inform reenactment segments where details carefully researched for historical accuracy must still, to some extent, be imagined. Additionally, the generally accepted notion that stories are shaped by multiple points of view will aid me as I move through a series of interviews with scholars and historians able to elucidate some of the themes and historical details that I've laid out. Circling back, narrative inquiry supports self-reflection, encompassing both self-study and self-reflexivity. And self-study is an essential component of this research as I formulate and represent questions that I'm compelled to ask myself publicly. To wit, how is a non-Canadian white settler descendant, a visual artist with no formal training as an historian, qualified to tell this story? Are there ways that I can consider my life experiences in relation to my subject matter towards making sense of my desire to engage with this very loaded content? Towards answering these questions, I must tell stories and represent them persuasively. The research and the outcome will thus conjoin. Methods of self-reflexivity turn on exposing a work's authorship or its means of production, which is tied to postmodern literary form called metafiction, which quotes, just a wiki quote, sorry, emphasizes its own constructedness in a way that continually reminds the audience to be aware they are reading or viewing a fictional work. Metafiction is self-conscious about language, literary form, and storytelling, and works of metafiction directly or indirectly draw attention to their status as artifacts. So I'm therefore aiming to contest the authority of the documentary format itself and create equivalences to literary forms in hopes of sparking individual imagination and investment to spur viewers towards their own processes of self-reflection in relation to all that I have presented today. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. So if you could stop screen share, excellent. We'll come back and have a discussion now. And I'll just remind the audience members, if they'd like to ask Amanda a question or have a comment, if you could type it in the chat or the Q&A. So I'll get started. Thanks so much again, Amanda. Let's start where you ended. This idea of you're committing to a kind of persuasive storytelling, if I have that correctly, but then thinking through this concept of metafiction as something that, you know, at the heart, I think, of your experimental filmmaking is a destabilization of knowledge. You're even this presentation today, like you're showing us images. Some of them are exactly on point and they're referencing slavery. Others are so-called random, right? So even, you know, disrupting correlations between our understandings of image and text as bound together in knowledge production. All right. So with this idea of persuasive storytelling, which I think if we look at histories of documentary film or even narrative film, how do they persuade us when we're watching a film? Nostalgia, sentimentality, manipulation, sometimes at a certain level, like the soundtrack of a film, for instance. I think, are you frozen, Amanda? Okay, so Amanda's frozen. So let's see if we can get Amanda back to answer the question that I was posing. We'll see if behind the scenes we can text her and okay, there you are. So Amanda, I think you didn't hear everything I was saying, but so do persuasive storytelling and metafiction actually then work together or not, right? Because if you're trying to destabilize knowledge, but at the same time, you want to bring people along and you want to inform them about these histories, about their centrality to the Canadian narrative and the US narrative, that slavery is not tangential, it's not something we should just discuss in Black History Month. So, right. So can you talk about that a bit more?
Yes, absolutely. What I did today with these kind of discorrelating, you know, isn't what I'll be doing in the film. You know, what I did today, I'm sure at some points was baffling. I don't want my film to be baffling at all. The one thing that I'm going to be doing is all of the footage that I'm going to be creating, all of the interviews with specialists and experts and historians is going to be transformed into this kind of type of animation, which is called rotoscoping. People might know this from what is his first name? Linklater's Waking Life film. He did a second film that's like this as well. This kind of animation is really interesting because it looks quote unquote realistic and it is taken from live footage, but it's just kind of, the details are kind of wash out, lines become more pronounced, so it is therefore animated. So it's this in-between place. You know, it's not like some people could animate by hiring an animation artist who would just make cartoon-like imagery. No, that's not what I'm doing. It's this in-between place where the voices, the images of scholars will come through, their affects, their hand gestures will come through, and yet also be slightly abstracted in a way. So it's as though you're in this story time modality.
Okay, excellent. And I have a question from Emily Drakio. She says she apologizes if you already addressed this at the beginning of the talk. She was having trouble with her Wi-Fi, but she was wondering what your target audience is for the film.
Oh gosh, that's a great question. You know, I have to make the film. I don't want to lose my audience of art-going, you know, experimental film people. But the film festivals also have a broad address to a certain extent. Not every work in those kinds of like places do, but a lot of them do. But on the other hand, I would like to make something that could be on, I don't know, like PBS, you know, not that they would do this work because PBS is very, but like PBS circa 1965, you know, when they were slightly more experimental, but they were still going for very broad audiences. So I don't know, I hope that answers your question. I want it to be, you know, something that anybody could watch and get something out of.
Excellent, thank you. I'm wondering, I'm struck by your description of Angelique, how she resonates for us in terms of her personhood on a contemporary level. As someone, as you to paraphrase you, if we, you know, and of course we can never do this, but if we were thrown back, you know, 200, 300 years into slavery, the way that we'd react at just knowing on the face of it how wrong it was and that it was an atrocity. And I'm wondering if part of her appeal in terms of her personhood is the fact that the scholars who have worked on her have been able to recuperate facets of her life and identity that deal with her romantic, her intimate, and her sexual choices, which is something that often we do not get from biographies of enslaved people. Right, that's what's suppressed. That's what's written out even of their, you know, the ones who were able to write fugitive slave narratives, because that was taboo for the white abolitionists who often authorized those texts. So I didn't want to hear about those aspects of their lives. So can you comment on what you think it is that resonates so powerfully with different people who encounter Angelique in terms of that notion of her personhood?
Yes, well, I mean, I appreciate what you're saying, and I didn't really bring that out. I didn't draw that out, but I think that's a really interesting point. You know, that, oh, she had this boyfriend, this white guy, you know, and we also know, and it's been put out there by the historians, that she had 3 children. Mm-hmm. She had a child who died.
Okay, so let's see if we can get Amanda back again. There's some problem with her internet, I believe. So sorry, Amanda, you froze for a bit. So when you were saying that she had children, can you go back to that point? Because you froze on us.
Yes. Okay. So Angelique had 3 children. She had a baby who died, mm-hmm. And then she had twins who died. Early on, like I don't think either of these children lived to be a year old, but the question arises: who impregnated Angelique, and was she raped by her enslaver? Was she bred with, I think, possibly the only other enslaved Black person in Montreal? There probably were more than
one more. Yeah, there were a few. There's a population.
Yeah.
But
there was a so, you know, here she is subjected to God knows what. Yeah. And yet she's kind of still interested in having, you know, and again, this is a presumption. No one knows what goes behind closed doors, right? But that the 2 were lovers, Angelique and Thibault. So it is, you know, I guess, you know, titillating, you know, but I chose to focus more on like the stuff she said, because that just reminded me of myself, unfortunately.
Okay. And I think even besides being titillating, again, it's a part of enslaved people's lives, like their choices of their partners, because those of us who study this understand that many of those choices were taken outside of their hands, which is why we don't discuss enslaved people as having agency. So it's rather powerful that we've even been able to recuperate her desire for a specific relationship as opposed to what was imposed upon her. I think that's very powerful work you're doing there, Amanda. So what about this? Okay, so you come from this long tradition of being an artist, of course, a professional artist, but working within this partnership. So, and what you described as, of course, and I read it in the bio, as a partnership with your husband. So now you're entering into different types of partnerships, right? And you're having to take on different roles. You're going to be an interviewer. You're going to be a puppeteer. You're going to be a filmmaker. So can you describe now what these new, I think there's multiple partnerships within this, the masters, the outcome of your masters in making of this film. Can you describe what you think that will look like and what you think that will take from you in terms of adapting to these multiple roles within one project?
It's super hard. It really is.
Yeah.
But I will be aided by, well, yeah, I mean, right now I need to begin the process of outreach to scholars, experts, historians who will, I'll describe what I'm going to do and try to, get them to be involved. I'm going to be aided by going to a residence in Montreal. So I will actually be in Montreal for 3, I think really 4 months, where I'll be able to sort of just be on site and go to these places. And that will be so important. And I know that in the residency program, I'm going to have to make presentations. So this ongoing process of explaining what you're doing as you're doing it is always a challenge, but it's always really helpful because, you arrive at different points and then you're then asked to kind of rise up and say, this is where I am now. In terms of self-inquiry, one idea I had is to talk to my 2 brothers, to interview them as we tell our story together, rather than me, speaking into my phone, which is kind of this, like, I associate it with a kind of teenager approach to self-inquiry, and I'm not putting that down, but I just don't know if I can do that. So my brothers, my 2 brothers, we all grew up in the same way, and we're all kind of interested in, African-American history. So I want to kind of talk about why that is. So they both said okay to that.
Excellent. So another partnership again on the familial level. Excellent. So a question from Chris Gismondi. Chris says, wonderful talk, Amanda. I'm curious how you see your film against other fiction works on slavery, like novels, TV, films, and plays. What inspirations or differences will there be, or what do you seek to do differently? Thanks, Chris.
Oh God, I mean, I guess I don't want this to sound arrogant, but I don't relate what I'm doing to any film that I've seen out there. 12 Years a Slave, or I mean, I could go on and on. There's so many.
Okay, when we get her back, we'll get her to reiterate anything we've missed.
They don't cut it.
Sorry, Amanda, you cut out around 12 Years a Slave.
Okay, there's many films, and I don't relate to the films out there. What I've been looking at and thinking about are very, very recent trends in movies or things made for television where interviewing is part of it. And there's these like subtle moves where they don't tightly edit things anymore. So the voice of the interlocutor, the interviewer, like me, will be heard as they answer the question, as they pause, as they're interrupted, as they're seen thinking. Now, obviously, you don't want to have this go on and on because it needs to be tight. But recent productions are really laying bare the process of interviewing. And also, there was this kind of, well, I liked it, but I won't even mention it, but there was a kind of thing that was a multi-part episodic about, and it was made by a movie star about histories of movie stars. And he's super famous. So he used this FaceTime or Zoom approach where he is pictured and the person he's speaking to is pictured. So you're seeing a conversation in real time. So those techniques will kind of lay bare processes of interviewing as being having authority, but also belonging to individuals at the same time. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. And actually the process of putting it together and not making it be this whole polished thing at the end, which again, seems like it's the one authoritative narrative that could possibly exist, right? To, again, going back to your engagement with experimental film and the destabilization of knowledge. No, thank you, Amanda. So a couple of questions to end here. One is, you started by saying you're not a trained historian, but I'm wondering then what you believe are the benefits of you not being a trained historian doing this work, right? Because we know there's all these problems with documentary films, exactly what you've laid out in terms of them giving the appearance of being shot out of the earth and not being constructs and not being edited and not being productions which are partnerships and which have failures and gaps and holes and fissures. So what is it that you bring to the table as someone with your background coming in as an artist, but then someone who's accruing this knowledge and expertise and training in art education and also in the study of transatlantic slavery and Canadian slavery? What is it that you can bring to the table, you think, that a historian or some other more typical, typically trained academic would miss or overlook?
Okay, well, I mean, there maybe are lots of ways of answering that question, but I'll say that historians and academia, it's like is geared towards the idea of discipline and of going deep and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into a subject. Like that is what academia is. And so therefore, it's hard to come back out of that, right? And so, I mean, artists think I think in associative ways, bringing in like various things that I've been interested in the course of my life. And, the artist can hopefully, like a poet, make a leap. And often that's through visual means that encompasses many words, thoughts, and ideas. I mean, that's what artists generally and poets generally can do.
Excellent. Thank you. And just to conclude then, I think it's really interesting again, and thank you for naming yourself and identifying yourself for us so we understand where you're coming from in terms of your identity and your subjectivity. So you talk about being an American, you're living in Canada, you're living in Nova Scotia right now, but you're studying New France. So, and you also spoke at the top about Canada's safe haven myth, which most of us probably know about, but I'll just articulate. In Canada, as you said, the average Canadian knows nothing about the 200-year history of transatlantic slavery under the French or the British, and it's nowhere in our curriculum from elementary school to, and very little in universities. So, now that you're in Canada, looking back at your nation, what parallel performances of innocence are you able to see more clearly in terms of the American cultural and historical landscape now that you are not, for the moment, living in the USA? And I say that as someone who's just moved to Massachusetts, and getting a clarity, you really do, I think, when you leave home, get a clarity on what home is, because you have this other perspective in terms of being deracinated for a moment, right? So what is going on for you now, looking back at the USA in terms of these histories and ideas?
Well, I mean, look, it's not brand new for me, but I mean, over the course of just being interested in these topics, I have been learning, well, I mean, that no one knows, the way New York City, the way New York State, the way Massachusetts have denied their own involvement in slavery, their own histories, and it's astounding to me, really, I mean, so Massachusetts, their mythos is that we are the state of abolition, we're Yes, I mean, that's something to be proud of, but it's certainly not the whole story. That's not the whole story. And New York has, oh my God, I mean, New York, it's interesting to learn about my own city as being rooted in avarice from day one. And that included really having an investment in keeping slavery alive because of through commercial interests, investment in the plantation system, and on and on and on. And so of course there was slavery, there was, you know, enslaved people living in both of these states, you know, so things like that, you know, but and I mean, I actually learned details recently, but I guess my recent studies have been about the presence and histories of slavery of Black people in California. That's a brand new topic for me. So I'm just learning as I go along.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Amanda, for a wonderful presentation. Our second Fellows Talk of Slavery North. Thank you all for joining us. And you can find Amanda's talk will be posted to our YouTube channel. And stay tuned because later this fall, hopefully we'll be launching our Slavery North website. So thank you all for being with us. Have a great day. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Charmaine.
Thanks, Amanda.